The Python Show.
Hello and welcome to the Python Show. This is your host, Mike Driscoll. And today we have a special guest, Stephen Gruppetta, coming to us from the UK. Stephen is a friend of mine from Twitter, and he does a lot of really cool stuff on Twitter. He's got the Python coding book, where he talks a lot about using Python and the Turtle library. He also recently started the Python coding Slack newsletter, which is really awesome. You should definitely check it out. And I also know him from Real Python, where he occasionally writes. So welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. We do spend a lot of time on Twitter, as I think it seems like it seems like we know each other so well from Twitter. So yeah,
I know. I said this. We were just talking about this and how it's like virtual friends, but we're actually friends. It's really cool.
indeed. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you as well. So let's start out by having you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to like programming in general.
Yeah, I think you often hear about programming journeys, and one thing you realize is that they're all different. I mean, some people started coding when they're 2 years old and never stopped. I'm not one of those. I didn't really do any coding when I was, maybe I dabbled a bit when I was a teenager, but not really. In my undergrad, I didn't do computer science. I studied maths and physics, and I had one module at some point. It was Pascal, actually. That's the language we learned. But it was one of those modules, you need to get the credits, you get it done. I can't say I left my undergrad knowing any programming. It was then when I moved on, that's when I came to the UK and I started doing my research work. I was doing a PhD here in London. And on day one, you realize I need to be able to program. So I was doing a PhD in physics, and the type of research I was doing, the research group I was in, programming was a key part in all the stages, in sort of modeling what you're doing, analyzing data. So on day one, I'm like, I need to learn how to program. And that's how it started. Initially, it was a tool for me to do my research. Over the years, I started to enjoy it more, get better at it. It's sort of like a virtuous circle, right? You get better at it, you enjoy it more, so you get even better at it. This was MATLAB. So most of my research years was using MATLAB, which was quite common at the time, still is, but was especially common at the time in sort of the science academic environment. So that's how I came into programming, almost as an accident, if you like, as a tool I needed for my scientific work.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know a lot of people who use MATLAB. My old employer used it quite a bit when they were modeling like GPS coordinates and mapping systems and stuff. So, I know it's popular, and I know a lot of people are kind of transitioning to like using Python, and I think it's Matplotlib a lot. I know they're not exactly the same. They're not like a drop-in replacement,
but they're very similar. Yes, I mean. I started my research in 2000. So Python was obviously, it existed, but it was much different to what it is now. So I think at the time, MATLAB was very common in all of these scientific environments. Nowadays, I think there's been a bit more of a shift away from MATLAB, which is quite expensive, to Python, which is obviously not. And also Python has this broad community that in some ways it can do almost anything that MATLAB can do, but it can do lots more, and you have this community to go around. So if I were redoing my research work now, I'm sure I'd be doing Python, not MATLAB. But all those years ago, that was the choice.
Yeah, I totally get that. They weren't teaching Python when I was in university either, so it was kind of funny to hear you talk about Pascal, because they were teaching COBOL when I was in college. But COBOL and C++.
I think Python just about had started when I did my undergrad, so it could never have been Python. So
yeah, I think Python started, I want to say 1991-ish was when the first
No,
one got
I was
released.
A bit later, to be fair, but yeah, it was certainly not a popular language. I mean, I was doing my undergrad in 96 to 2000, I think. So things have changed.
So this kind of transitions into my next question for you, but why are you focused on Python now versus some other language?
Well, that's a good question. So when I talked how I worked in scientific research for a while, so that was my first career, if you like. And then
Hmm.
7, 8 years ago, I sort of decided, for all the whatever reasons, to move on from academia. And one thing I liked a lot about my previous work in research, apart from the science, obviously, I
Hmm.
by the end of it, I enjoyed programming, and I also enjoyed the teaching side. As an academic, I taught undergrads, and unlike many other academics, I actually enjoyed the teaching. So then, when I moved on from academia, I thought, okay, one thing I can do is I like programming, I like teaching. Let me merge them, and that's how I got into the teaching of programming. But
Mm.
clearly, MATLAB wasn't going to be the language I'm going to do that in. So
Yeah.
Python came about because two reasons, I guess. First of all, coming from a scientific background, by the time I finished my academic career, Python was becoming the other language. You had MATLAB and you had Python, were sort of so it was an obvious science-based language. So I could sort of carry on what I was bringing in from the scientific programming from
Hmm.
MATLAB into Python, and also it was a very language growing so quickly. It sort of made sense to go down the Python route. The other reason is a lot of what I do is, especially when I first moved on from academia, is to actually teach kids. I mean,
Mm.
on Twitter, we'll probably talk about Turtle. That's where the Turtle comes in. But on Twitter, I talk about all sorts of things. But on my day job, as it were, um, uh, we focus a lot on teaching kids on a daily basis, and we do it using Python. And again, the decision there is sort of almost straightforward, right? If you want to teach kids a proper language, Python seems to tick all the boxes. So I think for all those reasons, the sort
Yeah.
of the scientific background I had, and it was an ideal language to teach beginners, especially children. It made sense for me to transition from MATLAB to Python, and that's where I started to learn
Yeah.
more about Python and start to teach it eventually.
So I'm curious because I'd like to start teaching my daughter Python. How young is your age group go when you're teaching
So
Python?
we start from 7 years old, which
Oh
is
wow.
fairly young. Obviously, what you do with 7, 8 year olds is very different to what you do with 14, 15 year olds.
Hmm.
But it's surprising how they can pick up. This is where the Turtle module will come in, right? We use the Turtle module a lot because
Yeah.
you can start from day one creating things that are visual and exciting. And you don't need a lot of code to get something that looks pretty on the screen with the Turtle module. So 7 year olds can start to do. There isn't a lot of typing you need to do. I mean, one of the biggest
Yeah.
problems 7 year olds have is actually the typing and the spelling. But if you
Yeah.
have autocomplete and you have short lines, Fred dot forward, there isn't that much typing to do.
True.
So they can start, and then as they grow, they can obviously start to do more complex things. So yeah, 7 year old is where we start, which is
Hmm.
younger than most to teach Python, but it does work.
Well, that's good to know. I know a lot of people start with Scratch when they're that young, and then move to Python. I want
Yeah,
to say in their teenage years.
it varies a lot. I think. I mean, I don't deal much with schools, but I think one of the biggest problems with schools overall is that it's much harder to teach Python than to teach Scratch. So I
Hmm.
think some schools tend to keep on teaching Scratch just because it's a bit more manageable uh, without
Okay.
having the programming expertise. It becomes
Yeah.
harder to teach Python. There are exceptions, of course. There are, I mean, I'm sure you and I know some brilliant teachers on Twitter, but not every school in every country has those, expert programmers who. So I think that's the reason why
Yeah.
Scratch tends to persist a bit longer because it's easier to teach as well.
Yeah, and I think some countries just emphasize it more because I recently learned, I think it was last year, that like the France is like mandated Python in schools, I believe. It's like the official language they're teaching.
Okay, I know that coding in schools all around the world, I think in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, it's sort of become part of the curriculum in pretty much every country now. But I
Hmm.
think different countries take different approaches. I know, and um, I'm sure that in the later years, Python is the obvious choice, as we were saying earlier. It seems like
Yeah.
it's obvious choice to teach children for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, I agree. I'm waiting for America to actually do that a little bit more. I think it seems to be a popular elective in high school, which is, like 15 to 18-year olds. But I don't think it's not like it's a requirement. And so a lot of people don't even get to dabble in it until
Yeah,
they're almost out of their school years, which is unfortunate.
yeah. Yeah, I think the challenge with teaching programming using a full featured programming language, you know how it is. You can have 100 ways that a program can go wrong, and I think an experienced programmer can spot that quickly and help their student. But if you're not an
Yes.
experienced programmer, you might spend a lot of time, and that restricts what you can teach. I think so. I think
Yeah.
it's not an easy subject to teach unless you have that good level of expertise. You
Yeah.
need to be more than a step or two above the children, I think. So that's what makes it a bit harder, I think. But
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. All right. Well, I don't really want to change the subject, but we need to keep moving along. So, could
yeah,
you tell us more about your Python coding book? Because I think that's really cool, and I'd like our listeners to know more about it too.
yeah. I think I've always liked writing. During my research
Hmm.
years, I liked coding and teaching, but I also liked writing. I think I was unusual in that, when I was doing my PhD thesis, I actually enjoyed the process of writing, the actual writing
Yeah.
the thesis. So when I was teaching Python to adults, I always felt like I want to give them some notes that reflect the way I teach. There are great books out there, such as yours, Mike. But when you're
Mm.
teaching, you sort of want to give your students something that is in the same tone and the same style as how you're teaching them.
Yeah.
So I started sort of writing some notes, and then those notes grew, and they grew a bit more, and eventually they became a book. And I think the main thing about it is that it is my vision of how programming is. It's very much my
Hmm.
personal way of seeing programming. And therefore, for those students whom I teach, and now hopefully for anyone else who wants to read it, as it were, it's like my perspective of how I see programming. I like to think of it as
Yeah.
it's the book I would have liked to have when I was learning. It's the way I learn, the way I see things. So hopefully, some other people might also see things the way I do and resonate with how I write. So yeah, primarily I write because I enjoy writing, but hopefully it has some benefit for some people who like what I write as well. So it's not quite finished, I have to say. It's in late beta stage. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I still need to tidy it up a bit, and it's still online as well only. So I think that my next project is to sort of tidy it up and then bring it into other formats. I know you're an expert in that, Mike, to sort of bring it into some other, ebook format, PDF format, who knows, maybe printed format. But
Yeah.
at the moment, it's there on the web. It's not great to read because you have to scroll through pages. So I want to move it into a better format. But
Yeah. I totally get it. Yeah. Your description of the writing process reminds me a lot of my own thoughts on when I wrote my first book. I'm like, man, when I was learning Python, I wanted to know, X, Y, and Z, and none of the books I had at the time taught it. So when I learned how to do it, yeah, I put it on my blog, and then I turned those articles into chapters for my first book. So it's funny that your book journey is very similar in that respect.
absolutely, yeah. I wonder whether all authors, or maybe most authors, actually follow the same path. As in, you write the things you want to read, and then
Yeah.
that becomes your style is the way you like to learn. It would be interesting to know whether other authors have the same path.
Yeah, I will mention I did put my original version of Python 101 online just to make it easier to search, and I used Sphinx, and it has a nice built-in search utility that just makes searching the entire book really fast. And I really liked that. And I keep thinking I'm going to update it to my latest version of Python 101. I just haven't done it yet, but I don't know. I haven't looked at your book in a while. If you don't have that search capability, I think it's really helpful to add it because it
Yeah,
makes
no, I think
finding stuff cool a lot easier.
absolutely. And I mean, in some ways, the website was there as a work in progress. In fact, I was
Hmm.
writing chapters as I went along. So a year and a half ago, anyone going on the website would find the first two chapters, and then the
Yeah.
third one, and then the fourth. So for me, the website was a way of, look, this is a work in progress. Now
Hmm.
it's almost complete. Now is when I want to sort of tidy it up and sort of
Yeah.
bring it to the first official release of the book, if you like, rather than the beta
Yeah.
version.
Yeah. I totally get it. I'm excited to see the finished product.
Hopefully soon.
Let's see. So it looks like you have a newsletter with a very similar name, the Python Coding Slack newsletter. Let's talk about that. How did that come about, and what are you
Yeah.
excited about it?
So you can see I've picked the naming style, right? I've got the Python coding book, and then I've
Mm-hmm.
got the Python coding stack. And the website I'm creating for sort of the hub of all of this is the Python coding place. So you can see where I'm
Mm-hmm.
getting there. Um,
There's a
yeah,
theme
so
there.
there's a theme there. Yeah, good or bad, that's my branding now. The Python coding something. Uh, um, I think it comes from the love of writing. I mean, the book was the notes for my students, which then became the Python coding book, was the
Mm-hmm.
first writing I did in the Python sphere. I had done writing before in my scientific work,
Yeah.
um, and then when the Python coding book, most of the chapters were in place, I thought, you know what, I'm going to start writing a few blog posts, and therefore I could write sort of articles from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
This was a time when you mentioned earlier, I've published some real Python articles as well. So I started to get more into, rather than just the book, writing standalone articles on a certain topic. And I did this on the Python coding book blog for a while. And recently, for a number of reasons, I thought, actually, I'm going to look at another platform. So that's where Substack came in. I thought, yeah, Substack seems to be a place where I can
Yeah.
put all my writing there. There's a nice community there as well, different from Twitter, but it has its own vibe. And it also forces me to write more regularly because now it's in a newsletter form. So I
Mm-hmm.
feel like before with the blog, I wrote whenever I had time, and let me write an article. Whereas now it feels like I've put pressure on myself, which is good. I like that, and I'm
Yeah.
trying to sort of write more regularly because it's now a newsletter that's going out to people regularly. So,
Yes.
so again, I primarily write because I enjoy it, and often I'm using the writing. I might pick on a certain topic and a certain function in NumPy, say, and often
Mm-hmm.
I'm writing because I want to actually learn about it more myself. I might
Yeah.
have used the function at a superficial level, or maybe used a few of its parameters, but I've never really dived into it. So I'm like, let me write an article about this. It forces me to go into the docs, explore every possible parameter, and then writing an article is a way of processing those thoughts for me to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, of course, I'm writing about things I know much better, and so yeah, it's been 2 months now since I've been publishing. I'm aiming at one every 5 days. I'm not sure I can keep that up. Maybe I'll have to go to one a
Yeah.
week. But I find writing as a way of sort of it's relaxing. So if I've had a hard day, a busy day doing stuff, I'm like, you know what, I'm going to do a bit now. I'm going to spend a couple of hours writing.
Yeah.
It's a bit like sort of meditating or going for a walk. I still do that. Yeah, I still go for a walk, but
Yeah.
writing is a way of sort of almost unwinding, and I quite enjoy it. So
Oh, I totally get it. I mean, I write because I like to do it as well. And I feel like I haven't been getting a lot of writing done. I've been working on trying to do this recording videos or even doing this podcast. I'm like, let's learn something new too and see how I like that as well. I've noticed, sometimes it helps to have a mix of formats on the blog as well as just just writing. So
that
I don't
is
know,
true.
kind of
Yes, that is
experiment.
true. That is true. Yeah, I mean, so the writing was my latest push as in to try and do it more regularly, which is why I started the Substack a couple of months ago. And
Hmm.
but yeah, I'd like to sort of venture into other forms as well at some point. So videos, and I've got some
Yeah.
video courses I'm thinking of doing. I know you're also recording lots of video courses. So as you say, it's nice to mix styles.
Yeah.
Not everyone likes to read. Not everyone likes to watch videos. It's nice to have a bit of both, so that those who prefer
Hmm.
to read can read your material, but those who prefer to watch videos can do that. And some people like to mix and match, I think, as well. Watch a bit of videos, read a bit. So I'm fully on board there. I think it's nice to have different formats
Yeah.
available.
I think a lot of people don't understand that from a content creator's point of view, you have to start with the writing, whether it's a video or not. You have to write out the
Yes,
story as a blog post. And maybe it doesn't get published, but you have that, and then you can turn it into a video or a series of tweets or whatever. So there's always all this writing in the background, just hidden away that your readers or
absolutely.
your viewers may never see.
absolutely. That's how you can flesh out your ideas, right? It's when you've written it in full, and then, as you say, you can sort of
Yeah.
repurpose it in other formats.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah, there was a time when, um, as you are, and as you know, I'm quite active on Twitter as well, and I think I started early last year. And
Hmm.
there was a time when sort of Twitter was my main. I created content for Twitter, but as you mentioned, it's sometimes you feel like actually first I need to flesh it out fully, and then I figure out how to
Hmm.
change this into 5, 6, 7 tweets.
Yep.
Whereas now I've swapped it over. Now my posts on the Substack, they are my main content, and then once I've published those, I'll take bits and put them on Twitter. So
Yep.
I much prefer it that way as well.
Yeah. I think my content cycle has been blog post, then book, and then take the book and make blog posts out of the book, and then make those posts into Twitter pieces, and then you can just kind of recycle it into
Yeah, yeah,
different
yeah.
formats. It's really
And
kind
get
of
the
fun.
videos in as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, stick some videos in there. Um, oh, one of the first things that attracted me to your Twitter account was all these cool animations you do with the turtle module. So, you've talked a little bit about that, but why do you use the turtle module so much in your examples? And what
Yeah,
do you
yeah.
like about it?
It feels like I'm building a bit of a reputation as the turtle man. Is it? Funny enough, I don't post that much. I mean, most of my content on Twitter on what I write, I mean, only a small percentage of them are turtle.
I
But
know.
no, no, no. But look, it's a good thing, right? I think when people see them, they're like, "Oh, I didn't know you could do that with the turtle module." Often the turtle
Hmm.
module is seen like, let's draw a few nice shapes and pentagons, and so
Yeah.
I've taken it upon myself to push turtle to the limit. It came from teaching kids, right? When I moved to sort of teaching Python full time, teaching kids was a big part of it, and I wanted to create my own curriculum. Same as with writing, a curriculum that
Hmm.
reflected my approach to teaching coding to kids. Is I want to treat it as a proper subject, the way you would teach maths and science, but it still has to be fun and engaging. And I think that's
Yeah.
where the turtle module comes in. Right from day one, you can do something, kids who have never coded in Python, on day one, you can do something that looks pretty. And the kids will
Hmm.
be like, wow, I like that. And then once you've built that tool, you can push the turtle module. Of course, you can't only the turtle, right? You need to teach them other things. But it's surprising how you can almost every topic in sort of beginner, intermediate, even some advanced topics in Python, you can actually teach them via the turtle module, whether it's
Hmm.
object-oriented programming and classes, whether it's more advanced functions, with
Hmm.
there is a way of fitting them in. The data structures, you can write complex animations and programs that need, all sorts of, you need to think about, do I need a dictionary here? Do I need a list or tuples?
Yeah.
So you can actually introduce a lot of the fundamentals through something which is fun and engaging. So over the years, I've always pushed myself. How can I push the turtle module further and further? And
Hmm.
again, sometimes when I've had a busy day, I'm like, let me think of something to do in Turtle, and it's another way of relaxing. Let me create some animation in Turtle, and then I post it on
Yeah.
Twitter. And if people like it, I'm like, I'll write a blog post on this.
Yeah. Have you ever considered doing like any of those gaming modules that are popular with Python, like Pygame or Piglet or any of those for teaching?
So
Or
interesting. So yes and no. The reason I like, from a teaching point of view, the reason I like using Turtle
hmm.
more than Pygame and the other modules is because they're more what I like to call its first principles. So they don't do too much for you. So when you're
Yes.
teaching kids or any age, right? But in this case, when you're teaching kids, you almost don't want a module that hides away lots of functionality. You want the kids
Hmm.
to realize, how do I make two things? How do I know when two things have hit each other? In the Turtle module, you have to sort of do it manually and figure out when the distance is in other
Mm,
module.
yeah.
So I think that's what's nice about the Turtle module, is that it forces the students to learn the fundamentals of, you need to tell the computer program everything you want it to do. So
Yeah.
that's why we stick with the Turtle module. If the aim was to write games, the Turtle module is not the ideal module. But if the
Well,
aim
yeah.
is to teach beginners, I think there's a lot of benefit in sort of sticking to Turtle, because then
Hmm.
you have to do the hard work yourself, and that's where the learning comes in, rather than abstracting it away in the Pygame API, say, or whatever it might be. So that's the main reason I've always stuck to Turtle, purely from a teaching point of view.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I totally get that. I find some of these frameworks abstract too much away, and then when you have a weird bug, it can be a real pain trying to figure out what it is.
Yeah, and sometimes from a learning point of view, you almost don't want too many of these, higher level modules, because you want to learn how to do things yourself. It doesn't mean
Yes.
that in real life you don't want to reinvent the wheel, but when you're with the learning hat on, you almost
Hmm.
you want to reinvent the wheel sometimes, because you want to learn
Yeah.
how it's done, even if then in real life you're going to go and rely on some function, some package.
Well, yeah, it's like a lot of things in mathematics where you learn how to do something the hard way, like standard deviation, and then you find out how to do it the easy way, and
Yeah.
you're like, why didn't I learn the easy way first? But you don't understand it that well if you don't go
Uh,
through, you
Absolutely,
know.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, maths was one of my undergrad subjects, and lots of things you do there. Now you can sort of just write a single line in Python, hit enter, and
Yeah.
it's done it for you. And I'm like, oh yes, I did this all by hand in my undergrad, but there's a reason for it. I think it helps you
Yeah.
understand what's happening when you run that function. That says F52. You know what the Fourier transform is doing, or whatever it might be, right? Because you've learned
Hmm.
it in the past. So I think it's important to know what's happening, even if you then rely on the ready-made stuff, so to speak.
Yes, I agree. So I always find it interesting to find out what common problems you see with your students. Just kind of compare it to the people who read my books and see what they're similar. Do your kids have the same kind of problems that most of my readers are like adults typically? So I'm just curious. What are the common problems you see with your people that
Um,
you teach?
I think it's. I mean, I'm in some ways maybe a bit unusual, because I teach both kids and adults, so I see a
Okay.
lot of both. Others do as well, but it's quite different. That there are similarities, of course, but it's quite different. And I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the reasons is that an adult who's a beginner in programming, you almost need to unlearn how to think. You need to stop thinking like a human being and start to think in a computer way. And with
Yeah.
adults at the very beginning, I think that mindset is the hardest thing. It feels like either certain things are too obvious for us humans, but you actually need to write the code to do it. And therefore, they don't see that
Mm-hmm.
distinction. Kids sometimes are a bit better at that. And I often like to think that it's because they haven't gone through, they haven't spent 20, 30 years learning how to be human, and now they have to
Mm-hmm.
unlearn it. At 7 or 10, they still haven't fully learned how to be human, so it's easier for them to
Hmm.
think like a computer.
Yeah.
So the problems are a bit different. I think with adults, uh, at the very beginning, it's that mindset. It's learning to think like a computer rather than like a human.
Mm.
I think that's where I find lots of adults stumble.
Huh.
At the next stage, when they're ready to go from late beginner to intermediate, I think it's a bit of a different problem. I think in the beginning, you learn the for loop, you learn the while loop, you learn how to define functions. You've sort of learned all of these little blocks. Then you need to almost zoom out and look at programming from a bird's eye view. And I think
Mm-hmm.
at a later stage, that is a stumbling block sometimes, when someone is really good at writing for loops and writing functions or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but it's zooming out and seeing it as a whole and then bringing it all together. And I think that's a stumbling block in
Um,
getting to the intermediate stage. And there's no easy way of teaching that. I think it's another change of
yeah.
mindset. You need to sort of almost look at programming in a more holistic way, if you like.
Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah, I know from my personal experience when I first learned how to program, I felt like I had a mental block for like the first couple semesters really. I'm like, I get the syntax, but I don't really understand how to do anything outside of that. It took me a long time. I think it was my third year, and I'm like, oh, it's all coming together now. It's all magical. It's amazing.
Absolutely. I
But
mean, you're right, and I think many of us have gone through that route. And this brings us back to writing. In some ways, my writing is a way of initially for me to process these ideas. I know the syntax, but what does it really mean? And I start
yeah.
writing in some ways. It's because I wanted to process these ideas, and that's what I'm trying to do. With the blogs, the articles I write, and the book. It's almost giving this big picture of trying to link things together. I like to use analogies a lot. For example, I think it helps you
Hmm.
on. It's understanding what's happening beyond what syntax do you use, and do you put a square bracket or a round bracket here? You almost need to look at it
Yeah.
from a distance to understand it.
Yep. I totally get that. So, while you were talking about this, I realized I already have this question on my list, but I was going to ask you. So, how do you see AI helping or hurting students in their learning journey? Because I'm like, I don't know what I would have done if I had all these technologies when I was in school.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like pretty much everyone else, in the last few months, I've been learning how to use all of this generative AI.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, and I'm not going to pretend to be one. All I know is how I've
Yeah.
been using it. But of course, from an educational point of view, in fact, one of the recent courses I've run, which finished a couple of weeks ago, it was the first time where I had a section where it's like, look, let's actually go to GPT and let's use it as
Hmm.
part of our course. And I think we're all learning that it's a tool like all others, and I think it can harm if a student uses it to find shortcuts, because when you're
Yeah.
learning, you don't want the shortcuts. And this is especially true, I think, for kids, because adults are more, an adult who's learning to code is more mature. They know that there's no point in cheating in this exercise. But
Hmm.
with the younger ones, I think it can be detrimental, because they'll be like, oh, okay, I'm going to get GPT to write this code, which defeats the purpose of learning. But
Yes.
I think the benefits are so great. I mean, I've been trying to experiment with. I use it now instead of googling something. If I need something, and I'm
Mm.
getting my students to think, look, if you have a question, 6 months ago I'd say go on Google, ask the question, and then you end up on Stack Overflow on the documentation.
Yeah.
Now, before you do that, go to GPT and ask the question, see what it comes up with, and then yes, go to documentation afterwards as well. So I think it's the other place where it's great for learners. I think, especially in the early days when you write some code and then you want some feedback. And of course, if you have a live person help you, that's great. But
Yeah.
taking that code, putting it to GPT and saying, dear GPT, I'm a beginner in Python, so take it easy. Can you give me feedback on this code? Keeping in mind that I'm a beginner, because you don't want a beginner to be told use a lambda function here. It's like you want GPT
Yeah.
to know it, and I think that's something I want to explore more with my students. Getting GPT to give you feedback, but at your own level, right? And then as you become
Hmm.
more expert, you say, good, here's my level. You can perhaps we need to find a way of prompting GPT to sort of give it an indication of your level, so that the feedback you
Hmm.
get on your code is appropriate to where you are in your journey. So that's something I want to experiment with more, and then hopefully
Hmm.
help others. In the past, you can only do that from a real person, right? And if someone is
Yeah.
learning, the only way you can do that is you have your teacher, your instructor, your tutor, or mentor, and say, "Here's my code. Can you give me feedback?" That's still important, but I think they now
Hmm.
get more of that feedback, or more of a similar type of feedback from GPT, and that I think
Huh.
is a good way that learners could use GPT to their advantage.
I'm gonna have to try that out because I haven't used it that way yet. I'm curious to see what it would say about some
Yeah,
code example.
I think you need to prompt it for the level, because if you just give it, especially if you think of code that a beginner would write, right, which will not
Yeah.
be the same as a if you plug it to GPT, it's going to tell you, well, okay, change those to comprehension. It will simply give you the more. And as a
Yeah.
beginner, like I've never seen any of this, so I think you need to sort of prompt it. Look, I'm a beginner. Be kind, sort of thing, and then it
Mm.
gives you the right feedback for that level. But
Hmm.
I'm still experimenting with this as well. So
Yeah, that sounds like fun. I definitely need to try that out. I've been using it to teach me a little bit of Pandas because I don't know Pandas very well yet, and
yeah,
it's fun to see what it'll come up with. But it doesn't always give you executable code. It sometimes gives you garbage, and
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's the
that's
main. It might. I mean, I'm sure it will change in the future, but at the moment, whenever I'm introducing it to students, the first thing is, beware. It's not a 100% accurate source of knowledge. So
yeah,
one thing I've been discouraging students from doing, and I don't do it, is to get it to write code for you. I mean, unless
yeah,
it's a short function, unless it's a very self-contained function, which is anything beyond that, it's not great. But I think
Yeah.
asking it for feedback or asking it, I'd like to do this. What function do I need? As a beginner, you might not know about the split function, say the string split. You might go and explain, I would like to do this, and in a way that it's probably going to do better there than Google does, because in Google you're going to get lots of Stack Overflow pages, and from a beginner's point of view, you don't know what's right or wrong. Whereas with those easy questions, GPT will get it right most of the time. Use the string.split function, and you're like, good, I know the function I need, or the method I need, rather.
That's cool. I like that idea.
We're all going to be learning a lot. I think it's a steep learning curve for all of us, because it's a new tool. Like every new tool, I think we all need to, and it's changing as well. So we're learning. It is changing while we're learning. So I think it's going to be an interesting few months and years ahead.
Yeah, it's only been out like a year or two now. So I'm still getting used to it. I'm like, what is this thing? So I've been playing with it a little bit. Well, anyway, that was a really good talk. I really enjoyed, learning all the cool things that you do, and I always enjoy listening to how other people teach. That's always fun. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having me. No, I enjoyed this chat a lot as well.
Yeah. So I think we'll just wrap up here, and thank you so much for coming, Stephen. And I hope we can have you on the show again sometime in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yep. See you later.
The Python Show.